Wow, guys. Okay. Let's try to start here. We need to and then very soon our new norm. Just to be sure, Maggie, can you hear me?
Since Todd seems to be having some technical issues, I'll go ahead and take over. So, hi everybody. My name is Maggie Vandenberg with the IQ Business Group. I'm very happy to be your moderator for today's webinar, Effective Governance and Compliance with Microsoft Teams.
Maggie, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Sorry, folks, for having a little bit of that same technical difficulty that perhaps you have had in your remote experiences, and we apologize. But let's keep it rolling here. Let me get rid of that annoyance in the background. Sorry. Okay, I'm joined today by Ryan Britton. He is our senior Microsoft consultant, and my colleague Maggie Vandenberg, who has introduced herself with IQBG Marketing. So today, as part of our Microsoft 365 series, we're proud to sponsor our webinar for our public and private sector folks, including federal, state, and municipal government, and our private sector friends seeking knowledge and insight to make the most out of Microsoft Teams. So welcome to one and all. For those who have joined us before, thanks for coming back and joining us again for another webinar. And for those we haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, welcome. A little bit about our company. IQBG is a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. We've been around since 2008, developing ECRM and content services solutions, tailoring people, process, and technology to support your requirements. Before we dive into the strategies, we've wasted a little time with technical difficulties, but I do need to mention all participants' mics are by default muted, and the webinar will be made available for all participants to replay within 24 hours. So please look out for that email from us. And without further ado, let's talk about some Teams governance. It's a very popular subject, and we would like to talk about the problem with some of the things that go along with one of the highest used platforms for collaborations. It's great and super easy to access. Technology has given us this super easy access and easy to use platform, especially true given our new norm of how we're doing work. So it's kind of like the problem here is technology. It's too easy to put solutions in the hands of users with minimal effort. Just a few mouse clicks allow us to create content, send emails, instant messages, reply forward again. And in the case of today's subject, a Microsoft team can be deployed very quickly in Microsoft 365. But listen, don't get me wrong. I think Teams is an effective platform to promote collaboration and provide workspaces isolated from email. That's always our goal, to get people out of email. And those specific stakeholders you need to drive a common effort like projects or common goals and tasks are now separated in a separate UI. However, creation, development, management, and finally, governance plans are often overlooked as teams are rolled out across the enterprise. I think this is probably fairly accurate for those listening on today's webinar. So to help provide some insight for some of your team's governance pain points, so you can leverage your Microsoft 365 investment, let's turn it over to today's speaker, Ryan Britton. He is our senior Microsoft consultant. Welcome, Ryan. Take two.
Thanks, Todd, and welcome everybody. Yes, Microsoft Teams is the fastest growing business application in Microsoft's history. With over 500,000 organizations and 100 million active users in over 180 markets, delivered in 44 languages. It has become a pervasive global standard for conducting the business of collaboration and providing a productive workspace for modern work. Productivity and collaboration can be a double-edged sword, though, if they are pursued at the expense of governance and compliance. At the same time, compliance and governance can no longer be considered an optional tertiary objective for organizations. Organizations whose compliance and governance standards falter face high-profile reputational damage in the public eye and significant financial penalties. In recent years, we have seen giants in both the public and private sector with embarrassing and costly consequences for failing to take this seriously. With this in mind, this webinar is not going to be about technical configuration, the features of Microsoft Teams, or administrative practices for managing teams in Office 365. This webinar is about the governance and compliance as a planning process and aimed at provoking some thoughts around how to build practical practices in that area. So let me start with a story. And this may be familiar to many of you. It's a story that we've heard repeatedly from our customers. It starts with something beautiful, the installation of Office 365, and shortly thereafter, the activation of Teams. And once these things are in place, our protagonists experience the joy of teamwork, with the internet buzzing, with chats flying backwards and forwards. Teams are created and chat becomes a first-class citizen in the project process. Meetings evolve into recordable, interactive, productive experiences. Work becomes more productive, and ultimately collaboration happens, both internally and externally. And at some point, our heroes might start to get an uneasy feeling. Suddenly, there are teams for everything. It becomes difficult to figure out how many teams I'm on. I might struggle to find specific teams and start spending a lot of time Teams trawling. I might struggle to remember if a certain team should still be active. I might also struggle to remember where to find a particular document, or struggle to find a team in which is appropriate for the document I'm currently busy with. And then at some point, our intrepid adventurers might come to a dreadful realization. Where are my records? Who has access to my information? Who owns what? And who is going to manage this mess? And this situation is what we commonly refer to as team sprawl. And we've seen many customers who end up with dozens and dozens of teams across the organization and very little idea how to corral that back into some kind of compliance and governance strategy. Next slide, please. Okay, so in answer to this, we're seeing a number of reactive solutions to the problem of team sprawl. Microsoft partners have created tools to try and measure how much activity is occurring on a team in order to provide insight into its value. But is activity really a sign that a team is obsolete? Some teams have low activity levels but are still valuable. And even if it is, what do you do with the data? Automated archiving and expiry is an even more authoritarian approach to the same problem. A review process is a really good idea, but when does this happen? How do we know that a project has been completed in Microsoft Teams? Managed provisioning is part of the solution. You definitely want to lower your admin overhead for managing teams. Again, how does the administrator who is using these tools know when to act? Broad retention is something that we've seen applied as well. In other words, at a time when we archive or delete the team, we put a retention label onto it inside of Office 365 so that it becomes a record. And any records manager will tell you that retaining records without knowledge of what they actually are is a very bad compliance practice. And so this is really bad for your compliance position in practice. And so for folks who are dealing with team sprawl, next slide, please. There must be a better way. And the answer here is not a technical one, although technical tools can help to lower the admin burden. The real secret sauce is in planning for governance and compliance up front. Does that mean that you've missed the boat if you've already deployed Teams? Absolutely not. In fact, most of our customers have already deployed Teams when they contact us. There is obviously some consideration that you need to take in terms of applying this in an active Teams environment. And that brings us to building better teamwork. There's a few things that I should say at the outset. First of all, technology is not a silver bullet. And so a lot of the solutions that people are pushing forward with regards to managing team sprawl and putting in place governance is really not the answer. There isn't something that you can flip that's a switch that will just bring this governance and compliance to your environment. The other thing that we should acknowledge is that a goal without a plan is just a wish. And although we acknowledge that what we want is productivity and collaboration, and that's usually why we activate our Teams instance, what we also want is governance and compliance. And those are things that are not going to happen without a plan. And finally, we need to acknowledge that identity, governance, compliance, and productivity are all intertwined. We've seen many organizations where they have a very staunch security posture. And as a result of that, they hamstring their productivity simply because folks aren't able to share very easily. And it's very difficult for folks to set up the right context in which access to the document is allowed. Likewise, folks who focus predominantly on productivity may find that they hamstring their compliance and governance practices. And that's something that we were talking about in our little story that we laid out. Essentially, what we're saying is that if you are creating dozens and dozens of teams and putting information in there and you're not sure what information exists inside of these teams, it's very difficult to make those teams compliant and to bring the right level of governance to the information that exists within those teams. And so that brings us to step one, understand your people. And what I'm saying here is not that organizations that we deal with don't understand their people, but just that we need to acknowledge that it's different strokes for different folks when it comes to Microsoft Teams. Different people will use the tool in very different ways, startlingly different in some cases, just because of the types of roles that they have. If you asked a salesperson how they use Teams, it would be very different from an administrator. And some of the things that you would want to consider when thinking about understanding how your people use Microsoft Teams is what kind of responsibilities does a certain role have to expedite? And how would they use Teams to do that? What is their work style frequency? When are they at work? How do they work? How often is that remote? What types of challenges are they trying to overcome inside of that role? What are the needs and wants that they have inside of the role currently, specifically about ways to improve their job role? What types of scenarios are folks likely to use Teams into? And what kind of devices would they be using Teams on? And although this seems elementary, we're startled by the number of organizations who don't take a step back when they're implementing Teams and ask these types of questions. And obviously an extension of understanding your people is also understanding your workforce. Just because you have a specific type of role and you think you know how they will use Teams doesn't mean that everyone in that role will use them in the same manner. Because we have so many different generations currently filling the same sorts of roles, we have to acknowledge that there are going to be different ways that certain people will expect to be able to use technology to augment their job and to expedite it. Even in some of our own implementations of these types of services from a consulting perspective, there's certain members of the team who've been doing records management practices for 20 years and are very effective at their job, but they prefer to do that in a very different workflow for some of the younger people who are coming into the industry and have a lot more comfort with technology and are quite happy to share and to co-edit and all of these types of things when it comes to putting together documents. And so when we are addressing how these roles might interact with the software, we also have to acknowledge that different generations will interact with it in different ways, and either go about training folks so that we can reach some kind of consensus, which is a compromise for all of the generations on how to use it, or otherwise try and broaden the capabilities so that there's lots of different ways to expedite the same functionality within Microsoft Teams. And so here is an example of the types of things that you would want to be thinking about if you're starting to think about how folks would use Microsoft Teams. You want to create role profiles, and this is an example of an administrator profile. What we have here is a day in the life, which kind of speaks about frequency of work, the types of tasks that get conducted, when they are conducted, and it's really a storyboard that tells us how this person works most effectively. And in some cases, you'll find that once you have this day in the life and you introduce teams, this might change quite significantly, and hopefully for the better if we're worth our salt. We also want to identify key scenarios that these roles would be looking to unlock using teams. In some cases, smarter meetings are really important for that role. In other cases, it's largely administrative, and so meetings are not really important. They're just looking for a workspace that will bring different applications together. Looking at the different types of capabilities which would be required, and also importantly, the types of devices. We spoke about the differences between a salesperson using Microsoft Teams and an administrator who's largely office bound. What you'd find is that that salesperson would probably be interacting with Teams off of their mobile device or off of a tablet, whereas the office-bound person might be doing the same thing off a desktop. And those are things that we need to understand in terms of mobility, the capabilities of the device, and we certainly want to be documenting all of those things as we drive out these profiles so that we have a really good idea how best people can use the technology. And that brings us to step 2, understand your information. It seems very elementary, but in many cases, a person within a role understands very well what types of documents they work with and how those documents evolve and where to store them, but it may not be documented very well from an organizational point of view. And so what you may find a valuable exercise is to think about the type of hierarchy or taxonomy of information that you would want inside of your organization. Things like financial documents and operational documents and legal documents and departmental documents and all of these different types of documents. And in many cases, you'll find that the process of doing this is of great value to the organization anyway, because most of these documents are going to have templates associated with them. Folks who are being onboarded into a role would need to know where these documents sit, all of these types of things. And if you look at some of the exciting new functionalities that are coming out as part of SharePoint, Syntex, and Cortex, which are Microsoft initiatives to bring artificial intelligence to recognizing these types of documents, you'll see that getting these types of things in place up front is a really great way to set yourself up for success for some of the great technologies that are coming down the roadmap this year. Once you've thought about what your information taxonomy looks like, you obviously want to try and associate all of that with your records schedule. What you'll normally find is that different types of documents that exist in the taxonomy from the previous slide will map to a single series inside of your record schedule. And obviously record schedules are different per organization, and a lot of them are influenced by the type of industry that an organization is in, or the region that an organization is in, or whether or not an organization is federal. All of these types of things would bring regulatory compliance in terms of records management to an organization. And so it behooves us to put in place an effort to align our information taxonomy to this record schedule. And the process of doing so really helps us to understand the record keeping part of the life cycle of that document. We know when it's going to be created, and we have some idea how it's going to be shared and how it evolves. And hopefully after an effort of documenting that, the folks outside of the roles that actually do the work know that too. Now we want to make sure that we know how to align that information up with a formal record schedule. And so knowing all of this puts us in a really great place in terms of understanding the life cycle of each document. And if at this point you're thinking to yourself, wow, we've gotten through how many slides and we're not even talking about teams yet. Yes, that's right, because there's so much that underpins a great team. Most of it has to do with information. It has to do with the roles that are associated with that team. And that's why it's important to have those foundational elements in place before you proceed with fleshing out your teams. And believe me, that part of the presentation is coming. So documenting the life cycle of each document is valuable because it helps us to understand where information goes, how long it resides there, the different stages it goes through, when it is shared, how it is archived, how it needs to be maintained from a record keeping perspective. And this example that we have up on the screen just basically shows some of the questions that you might ask. Okay, so the document gets created and perhaps there is a specific template that gets used to do that, but how is it created? Who creates it? Where is it created? Once it's being authored, is it versioned? Does it have major and minor versions? Is it co-authored? Can multiple people work on it at the same time, or is that disallowed for this type of document? Does it have an approval process or multiple approval processes that it has to go through? If that document is shared, who can view it versus edit it? Can external people have access to it? Do internal people only have access to it? And does that sharing expire after a period of time? Does it need to undergo review? If that document is archived, is there a central location that it goes to where for posterity? Perhaps if it's an RFP response, you would want a central repository of RFP responses that the sales team or the response team can reuse in future responses. Who can access this archived document and for how long is it archived? And once we get into the science of record keeping, we want to understand how is this document recognized in terms of e-discovery and what is its value in an e-discovery process? Does it need a disposition review and what does that look like? What about tombstoning, which is the process of creating a defensible destruction of a document, where you would want to be able to say, yes, that document existed, but as per our record schedule, we have destroyed that document. And finally, the document is destroyed at a point in time. The process of doing this really gives you an understanding of how information flows through your organization, who's responsible for it, who has access to it, and how it is destroyed in terms of best practice and compliance. Now that we really understand the structure of our information in terms of the collaboration spaces and those types of tools like SharePoint, where we normally work with those, and then the record keeping part of that life cycle, which might be an external system, or as we are finding more and more commonly these days, it might actually be inside of SharePoint and Office 365 itself, using their compliance center. One of the things that we want to start to think about is what is the navigable information landscape of our organization look like? It's all good and well that we understand the life cycle, and it's all good and well that we have these teams and that we have an idea that information will go in and out of them. But how do folks get to that information? Ordinarily, what we're talking about in these terms is something like an intranet, where you would want to be able to have a home page, and for folks to be able to say, well, I'm looking for a specific document that is owned by a department, so I want to go to the IT department, and it's a project document, so I want to go see a list of all of the different projects that are happening within IT, and from there I want to be able to navigate to a place where I can expect to find this type of document. And creating this type of navigable information landscape is part of the secret sauce of getting these things right. And that brings us to step 3. Still not talking about teams. Now we're talking about understanding your processes. Why? Because if you can't measure something, you can't improve it. And again, there may be someone who has been inside of a job for 10 years and organically they're fantastic at their jobs. If they leave, do we know how to repeat that brilliance? Do we have the processes documented in such a way that we are able to train other people on those processes? And furthermore, in terms of teams, in terms of Office 365, and in terms of good governance and good compliance, do we understand what goes into those processes? The process of putting together storyboards that spell out step by step how these processes work, what are their enablers, what type of behavior changes would be required if we implemented Microsoft Teams. In other words, this is how the process works now. We introduce Teams into the mix. What kind of behavior changes differ? If it's largely a paper process, suddenly it's digital. There may be significant amounts of training and adoption and measurement and assistance that is required in order to keep this process running once Teams is introduced. what roles are necessary for these processes, what business benefits come out of the process, what metrics and measures can we use to measure the effectiveness of the process. If you put these metrics and measures in place beforehand, or if they already exist, then you have a really great way to measure the effectiveness of Teams once you implement the process using the Teams software, since you'll be able to keep those measurements and metrics and compare before to after. And the process of doing this helps you to identify risks where a certain process, once it becomes more digital, may require interventions in order to ensure that it doesn't degrade and that it does become more efficient. And it also helps you identify opportunities for automation. In a lot of cases, the process of moving documents between different areas or approvals or signing documents, all of these types of things can all be automated. And this is really a great way to justify a return on investment for a Teams implementation simply by identifying places that you can automate certain workflows within those teams. And so if you're looking for a good way to identify goals and success criteria, this is a good approach. It starts with language, and you try to represent the intent behind a process or behind a set of processes using a sentence that starts with, as someone in a specific team or department or business unit, I want to, description of what I'd like to do using a specific application or a technology. So, and I'll know when I'm successful when, and then you want to try and identify success measurements that you can put in place. Doing this beforehand, once again, gives you the opportunity to take a look at these statements at a later stage and see how much introducing Teams has really improved the lives of the workers who are using it. As an example, as someone in sales management, I want to have a single version of the proposal that everyone can access and edit rather than emailing different versions around the team. Using a SharePoint site to centrally store and share a single version of a sales proposal that my team can edit together using co-authoring in Word and PowerPoint, and I'll know I'm successful when my sales team can create proposals more easily and therefore have more time to close deals. And that finally brings us to step 4, understanding your teams. When we arrive at this place, we are forewarned and forearmed. We really understand our people. We understand the types of information. We've aligned that with a record schedule, and we really understand the processes that those roles need to expedite in order to keep the business successful. And so as we approach understanding teams, the first thing we want to acknowledge is that there are very different types of teams. There are teams that are focused, departmental teams, which exist for a very long period of time, usually include everybody inside of the department, and essentially are focused on the day-to-day workings of that department. Likewise with business units. You have discipline teams that are perhaps not aligned with specific departments or business units, but work across the organization. Management teams, which are sometimes a subsection of those departmental teams. Sales teams and campaign teams, which are centered around a campaign that has a start date and an end date and specific goals and metrics that you're trying to achieve through the campaign. Project teams, once again, a project will have a start date and an end date and a budget and things that need to be managed. Study groups, teams that are centered around a location, teams that are oriented around a specific event and don't usually exist for very long after that event happens. Case teams, resource teams, content teams, knowledge teams. Reading this, I'm sure that you could identify many different types of teams within your organizations. But the truth is that when we unlock Microsoft Teams, in many cases, we don't think about these things. We switch it on and we say, well, they'll figure it out. People will figure out what types of teams they need. But really, a lot of the information that is resident inside of the type of team is necessary in order to manage the governance of teams. Project teams, for instance, knowing when the end date of a project is, can help you start to think about how to shut down a team once that end date has passed. I'm not saying that all projects meet their end dates, but you certainly want to have an idea of what the life cycle of that project might look like. Some projects take years, others are over in a matter of weeks. And so in the same way that we've been thinking about information hierarchies and hierarchies within the organization in terms of an intranet, You can create a team organizational hierarchy inside of your organization as well. Identify the different types of organizational teams, whether they are strategic, departmental, cross-functional, whether they are transient teams that will only be around for a small amount of time, whether they are location-centric and are around for as long as the location is, or resource teams that exist as long as the resource exists, and knowledge teams that continually mine and expand certain resources in terms of a knowledge repository. Looking at this, I'm sure you can see that there's a lot of value in understanding the different types of teams and approaching the life cycle and governance of these different teams in very different ways. And so what we can do in a similar fashion to some of the other exercises that we've done when planning out this implementation is we can start to document team profiles. Some of the questions we would want to be asking ourselves as we do this is, what is the goal of this team? Who are the owners, contributors, and observers? Do we need guest access to this team? Do external parties need to be able to access it? What is the qualification criteria of a team? In other words, you shouldn't just be able to create teams. You should have a billing code for a project before you're able to create a project team, for instance. What about security and access maps? Is there an onboarding process? Do we have to go through a process of bringing people on board, going through training, setting up certain resources before the team has been fully incorporated? What are the individual roles from our exercise previously that need to be incumbent in this team? What types of documents and information do we need? How should information be organized within the team? Now talking about things like channels and tabs inside of Microsoft Teams. What is retention and records management? What are the different workflows, talking about the processes that we've explored that we want to unlock inside of these teams and automate potentially? And finally, what does the disposition and sunsetting process look like for these teams? And so as we get deeper into this planning process, we get to a point where we can actually start to map things out in terms of a team. And this is just an example that we've put up, but essentially what you want to be able to do is identify the different stages that the team will go through. In this case, there's initiation, it goes through a process of compiling an agenda because this is an event-centric team. There's some marketing that happens around that event. There's some preparation that happens just before the event happens. Finally, the event actually happens. Then there is a wrap up, and finally there is a record-keeping process. What you can see towards the bottom of the slide is that it's identifying for each one of these steps in this team process, who are the roles that are incumbent, and obviously we're well armed there because we've thought about roles and we've mapped those out. What are the tools that need to be used? And we map those out to each step as well. And what is the information that is required? The types of information being document types that you want to, that are necessary at each step. And putting together a map like this really sets us up in a very different way to understand intimately how a team is created, what its life cycle looks like, and what we do when it is finally sunsetted. And so that brings us to a quick discussion about the different layers inside of Microsoft Teams. And now we're talking about the Microsoft Teams technology. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to talk about applying governance at different layers. First and foremost, at the center of every Microsoft Teams team that you create is an Office 365 group. That is a security group that has members, and those members are either owners or contributors or readers, and you have to manage that group over a period of time. And so there is a level of security governance. If you could just advance us here, Maggie, then we can see that, yep. There's an element of security governance that has to happen around that Office 365 group. Likewise, for the SharePoint team site, there is information governance. In other words, underneath your team that you've created is actually a SharePoint site, which has libraries in it where documents are stored. And those documents inside of those libraries require information governance in the manner which we were talking about on a previous slide in order to make them effective. In the team workspace, we need team governance. This is the process of understanding what type of coordination needs to happen. When do chats happen? Do we record meetings? Do we want transcripts of those meetings? Are they kept in place as part of the efforts of that team? And finally, extensions and apps. And that's not something that we're going to talk about in the scope of this discussion now. But essentially what it's talking about is that teams may want to access external applications as well. Maybe it's Dynamics 365 or it's Salesforce. Whatever that external application is, you want to be able to open up a tab representing that application inside of the team so that you have less context switching backwards and forwards. And the process of doing that and governing how you access that now embedded application inside of Microsoft Teams obviously requires its own flavor of governance as well. Okay, and then that brings us to a question about creating team templates. And really, this is what we've been leading up to. What you want to be able to do is create specific templates for specific teams, understanding everything that we do about how to create a team and what its life cycle looks like, which may automate the process of creating request forms, digital forms that folks perhaps have to fill out as part of the team, either requesting something as an employee, making a demand of that team, or otherwise perhaps actually creating the team requires some kind of request form. An onboarding process and the approval process for creating that team. Automated provisioning, so that every time you create a project team, you don't have to go and create the same channels and you don't have to set up the same tabs, but all of that happens automatically. Pre-configured policies for all of your documents, so that you don't have to think about where to create things or how to store things or what you have to do to make them compliant from a records management perspective. By virtue of the fact that you're in the team and you're creating the document, those things are tagged onto the document for you. It needs to be linked to the SharePoint landscape. That's what we were talking about when navigating. You want to make sure that after I've created this team, because it's a project team and it's linked to the IT department, when I go to the IT department's intranet page, I can see a list of projects and my team that I've created for this project is now listed there. We want to make sure that we understand how libraries and lists work, and we want to put those in place so that document types are automatically created when they need to be, and that they're manageable through their different stages, and that their life cycles are honored inside of those libraries. Things like auto classification, in other words, and that's what we're talking about, when things are created in place, they're automatically classified as this type of document, and that allows us to go to great lengths to automate the process of ensuring that when that team is destroyed, for instance, or sunsetted or archived, that document goes into the right records management flow, if that is what's required, or perhaps into a central repository where it's available for shared access for repeat endeavors of the same team type. We want out-of-the-box workflows, our approvals, publishing workflows, all of those types of things, and then finally the actual sunsetting process. And the process of doing this, planning up front, is going to ensure that all of these things are known for each type of team, that we're not in the same situation that we were describing at the beginning of this talk, where teams are these amorphous things and where it's very difficult to reactively understand how long they should be around for, whether they have met their objective, and what to do with the stuff that is inside of that team when we do sunset it. And so if you've listened to what I've had to say, and you're thinking that you're not quite sure where to start, the best place to start is to understand where your organization is at. And the process of doing that normally starts with a set of assessments. You would want to understand where you're at from a security and identity perspective. If you have certain compliances that you need to meet, you would want to be able to assess to what level you are meeting those compliance requirements. From an ECRM perspective, you would want to review your records schedule, ensure that is in place and it's current and it's up to date and it's being properly enforced. And you would want to understand the level to which it is being enforced. You would want a teamwork assessment to take a look at the structure of different teams, the roles and the people who are involved inside of them, and to document that. You may want an information landscape assessment to understand if you have on-premise information, for instance, or if you have information that is not classified, how you would go about understanding what information you actually have, what risk is incumbent underneath, comes along with that information, and how you would go about better classifying that information and working with it in a more automated fashion. And finally, for organizations that have most of their software on-premise, you would want to know, if you're thinking about migrating to cloud, your level of readiness and maturity in that perspective. And these are all assessments that you would need to either conduct yourself, or if you would like IQ to assist with these types of assessments, these are things that we offer to organizations to assist them in understanding where they're at and what their compliance roadmap and blueprint might look like. Okay, and so that brings us more or less to questions and answers.
Ryan, thank you very much. This has been great. And once again, great insight, great content in these slides that gives us a ton to think about. I think my favorites are the journey slide and that anatomy slide. They really ground you, so to speak, to remember what Teams is exactly, how it fits into the 365 ecosystem, and how you could lose control of such a great tool by not incorporating governance. So folks, we are looking okay on time for Q&A, given we did have a technical difficulty at the beginning. And I'm going to turn that over to Maggie for our first question.
All right. So this question comes from Jamie. If you are already using Microsoft 365 and Teams, is it too late to apply governance?
No, absolutely not. And I think we spoke to that in one of the slides. Most of the organizations that we work with have implemented Teams, usually as a response to a need for remote working in these unprecedented times, and they are hitting their heads against some of the issues that we spoke about inside of that journey, where they suddenly have team sprawl, that their compliance and records officers don't know how they're going to get that information back into some kind of disposition workflow, and essentially they're a little stuck. It certainly means that you need to take some things into consideration, but I wouldn't say that you've missed the boat if you've activated Teams and you don't have the right governance. I would say that continuing on that path without retrofitting the governance is likely to extend the extent of the problem.
Okay, and the next one is from Joshua. Do you need to design the entire Teams hierarchy all at once?
No, and that's actually part of what we do for a lot of organizations who are just looking to prove the ROI and to understand what would be involved. Sometimes you can simply take some indicative teams or some teams that are interesting or have unique problems that you would like to see solved, or in some cases the teams that have the stickiest problems, and simply approach this a team at a time. Actually, in many cases in the consulting efforts that we've done for organizations where we have ended up rolling these types of governance processes through the entire organization, we still approach it business unit by business unit, identifying the roles, identifying the type of information, identifying the types of teams, and then essentially bringing each one of those business units up to compliance.
Okay. And the next one is from Andrea. What Microsoft 365 licensing is required to apply Teams governance of this nature?
Okay, so we spoke about, or we hinted at, a lot of different types of functionality throughout the presentation. If you have Teams, most of the exercises that we've spoken about don't require a feature of Teams. There's something that happens outside of that. You can understand your people, your processes, your information, the types of teams that you have without having to delve into Teams at all. The pieces from a technology perspective that you would need are Teams templates, which exist. There you would need a process or a way to kind of automate the creation of those teams. So you might need some extra development or some extra pieces in place so that you're able to automatically provision a type of team with all of the automation and the pieces that we spoke about. But that can be done on a normal E3 license or M3 license or G3 license or A3 license, depending on what you're doing. So no extended licensing needed in order to implement those types of things. Some of the things that we spoke about, like e-discovery, the advanced e-discovery workloads do require an E5 license. And some of the things for auto classification, where you are looking to auto classify based on things like content types and using an AI to do it, that would require an E5 license as well. I would say that you could probably get 90% of the way down the road if those advanced functionalities aside with your standard E3 type license.
Okay. And this next one is from Rob. Is this approach compatible with e-discovery and Office 365?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I would go so far as to say that e-discovery is made better by going through these types of planning exercises. We've assisted some organizations in a SharePoint migration where they have had some on-premise information, and they've moved that information, without classifying it, straight into the cloud, thinking that they would kind of move everything to the cloud and sort it out there. And the problem with that is that in an e-discovery process where you have on-premise file shares and those types of things, that requires a lot of manpower to find e-discovery results and to compile those and so forth. But in Office 365, you can be startled by the fact that if you put in a case number, you will start to get information out of people's personal OneDrives and all of these types of repositories, and that those results are instantaneous. And so, yes, it's much more efficient, and that's fantastic, and it can lower your overhead for doing e-discovery cases. But the problem with that is that if you don't understand your information and you haven't properly classified things, you open yourself up to a lot of liability as well, because folks could have stuff that are sitting inside of temporary folders that haven't been classified, all of these types of things. And so going through a process of understanding your information and putting workflows in place and making sure that information goes into the right disposition workflow when it needs to, really puts you in a position to A, make the best of these types of cloud tools, which can lower your overheads for doing things like e-discovery, but B, reduce your risk at having everything sitting inside of the cloud and being instantaneously searchable.
Okay. And I believe this is the last question, unless anybody has some last minute ones. This one comes from John. If we want to engage with IQBG, are all of the assessments indicated required to kick off the engagement?
No. And again, most of the organizations that we deal with are at different stages of a cloud journey, at different stages of maturity in terms of records management and compliance, different stages in terms of their ability to deploy resources from an IT department, all of those types of things. And so, and also, in many cases, there's other vendors that are providing things like records management systems or are doing the Azure Active Directory rollouts or whatever it may be. And so in a lot of cases, organizations will say, well, we've kind of got this piece figured out, we think, but we really need these pieces and we need to understand where we sit in terms of a record schedule. We'd like someone to take a look at it and see whether or not the policies that we have in place are relevant and whether or not it is compliant according to XYZ regulatory requirements. So those types of things we find very, very regularly. And so the assessments are really okay that enable organizations to choose where they would like to find low-hanging fruit and where they think there is a problem area that they could put a solution in place.
Oh, I believe that's all the questions we have.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. And real quick to Ryan's comment there, he's exactly right. This is not about a one-size-fit-all type approach. It's more about kind of like in the world of accounting, a balance sheet, a point in time to understand where you are in your journey, and we can help you with all of those things. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Maggie, for the Q&A. Again, great content, great insight, gives us a lot to think about. And thanks to everyone for attending today. We hope you have enjoyed the webinar, and if you have liked what you've heard, please reach out. Please follow us on social media. Our connections to link are on the next slide, Maggie, and be on the lookout again for that email notification indicating that today's webinar is available for replay. Thanks again one and all for today. Please stay safe, please stay healthy, and we will see you very soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.